Was a deacon in our church there, and they had moved here to Kenwood. Had moved just 2 doors down. And he called me one morning and he said, Brother Darrell, said, you still preaching? I said, oh yeah. I said, God's called me and I'm going to do it till I die. And he said, well, would you be willing to come down to the country and preach for us in a little old church? And I said, well, I'd be delighted to. So he gave me directions, and I left Lakewood, and I thought I went to the end of the world to come to Kenwood. I mean, I thought that was the longest trip as before the expressways and all the other, and got here, and here was this little old block building where, and you've heard the story before, where the people had saved their money, and when they'd get enough to buy one cement block, then they would put that in the offering until they got enough to build a little building and seat 50 people. And so when I got here, just a little plain block building. Inside was very, very pretty, but the outside just as plain as it can be. And on the outside, you had just enough, well, probably about from here to that wall to the property line, and same thing on the other side, same thing on the back, and then in the front, just enough parking space. So just a little tiny place. But I came here and enjoyed it so much. I enjoyed preaching here. And again, you've heard my story, but they said, well, would you come back and preach again next Sunday? And I said, I'd be glad to. Well, would you come back the next Sunday? I'd be glad to. And Brother Larimore, who was the pastor then, he said, well, Brother Darrell, won't you come down here and help us? And I said, well, as a youth leader or associate, what are you talking about? He said, well, as the pastor. And I said, well, now, Brother Larimore, you're the pastor. And he said, well, they need some young blood down here. And I was 24 at the time, and he said, will you at least pray about it? I said, well, yeah, I'll pray about it. That was on Sunday. Well, I went home, and on Wednesday night after the service, the phone rang, and it's Brother Larimore, and he said, well, we voted tonight, and you're the pastor. And I said, well, when do I start? He said, Sunday. I won't be there. So there I was, pastor of the Kenwood Baptist Church. But I'm telling you, we have had some remarkable, remarkable, remarkable days. There's been times that we've stayed here until 10, 11, 12 o'clock at night, fellowshipping and just laughing together and praising God for who He is and the answers to prayer and so forth. And there was a fellow that a bunch of us preachers had kept liquor out of Fayette County and Clayton County for 8 years. Anytime they tried to get it in, we'd meet and vote it out and so forth. And so the 2 counties were dry. And I heard about a Greek fellow named Carvelis that was going to come in here and open up a pizza place and put beer in it. So I told Brother Jim Butler, I said, Brother Jim, let's you and I go visit this guy, because the problem is not the liquor, the problem is his heart. And so I found out where he lived and told my wife I'm going to be at the Carvelis's, and if you need me, you can call there. But anyway, we drove down to the house, and Jimmy was his name, Jimmy Carvelis. And he came to the door, and I introduced myself and said, I want to talk to you a little bit. So we went in, and after we'd been there a little while, the phone rang, and his wife came to me and said, Preacher, that was for you. And I said, okay. So I went and answered the phone. It was my wife, and she said, I hate to tell you, but your daddy just died. So I went in, and Jimmy said, is everything okay? And I said, well, my daddy just died. And he said, well, Preacher, you go on and take care of that. And I said, well, Jimmy, I said, my daddy just went to heaven. I said I had the privilege of leading him to Christ right after I got saved. So he's in glory now. But if that had been you, I said, you'd be in hell. And I don't want that. He said, preacher, you go on to church, take care of your daddy, and I'll be at church on Sunday. I said, now Jimmy, you're not just telling me to get me off your back, are you? He said, no, I'll be there. So sure enough, he and his wife and little children came and sat over on the side, and I gave the altar call, and boy, they responded, and he went ahead and opened the pizza place, but he didn't put beer in it. And so after on Sunday night service, every Sunday night, about 25 or 30 of us would leave here, go down to Carvelis's pizza place. And he'd open the doors. You remember that, Brother Dooley? And I'm telling you, he'd cook some of the best pizzas you've ever put in your mouth. Mercy. And we'd sit there and laugh and carry on to midnight. It was a wonderful time. Happy, joyful times. Well, that's what the Lord wants from his people. He wants us to be joyful. He wants us to have joy that's unspeakable and full of glory. Well, in our story, what we have is we've got some fellows who are very sad. And I'm going to be quite honest with you. Many of the churches I'm in today have lost that jubilation, that joy. There's such a sadness in the atmosphere. Well, let me give you the story here. On Tuesday night, they had arrested our Lord, and of course, you know the story. They beat him, plucked his beard, tormented him to all hours of the morning. Then on Wednesday morning, and I always think about that on Wednesday. This is being Wednesday. I always think about this on Wednesday. On Wednesday morning, early in the morning, they put a cross on him, and he carried that cross up a hill called Golgotha's Hill. And when he got to the top of the hill, they took and laid him out on that cross, and they nailed his hands and they nailed his feet. They took that cross and they lifted it up in the air and dropped it in the hole. And when they dropped it in the hole, every bone was shaken out of the joint. And at 9 o'clock, from 9 o'clock in the morning till 3 o'clock in the afternoon, you see him hanging there. From 9 until noon, the lights are on. At noon, God cuts the lights out. He darkens the earth, and so he's not. And they're going to break his legs, because what they would do, the person who's being crucified would have a little stoop that he would put his feet against, and when he would begin to suffocate, he'd take and push himself back up and give himself some relief where he could breathe. And then, of course, he would give out of strength and he would sink back down. So what they would do is when they were ready for the person to die, they'd come along and break his legs so he couldn't push himself back up again. And so they broke the legs of the one on one side and on the other. But when they came to Christ, he was already dead. So they didn't break his legs. So they took him down off the cross and they put him in this borrowed tomb. And of course the story is too lengthy for me to go through all of it, but Mary went there, and eventually Peter, and so forth and so on. But anyway, the tomb was empty. And so here in our story in Luke chapter 24, there's some folk walking down the road, and they're having this discussion among themselves about what has happened and what's transpired over the last few hours. And in verse 24 and verse 17, and he said unto them, this is Jesus, what manner of communication are these that you have one with another as you walk and are sad? What are you talking about that's made you so sad? And they say, well, are you a stranger? Have you not been in town? Have you not heard? And they went on, and of course, as you read the rest of the chapter, as they walk along, they don't understand who Jesus is. They haven't recognized him. Their eyes have not been open to it. But anyway, he finally starts with Moses and the writings of Moses and explains how Moses talked about him in the Old Testament. Anyway, then when he does reveal himself to them, they said, didn't our hearts burn within us as he talked with us by the way? But here's these fellas where on Sunday after 3 o'clock, the disciples are not in good shape. I mean, they are so disappointed. They're so disillusioned because their leader, who had made many, many, many promises, it appears now they were all empty promises. I mean, what about the promises he made? What about the plans that we had for ourselves? And so they're sad. They're very let down. They're very disillusioned because it looks like everything that he's claimed is not going to come to pass. I mean, he's dead. And I'm telling you, disappointment, disillusion will absolutely suck all the life out of you. If you let things, people disappoint you, if you become disillusioned with a situation, it will absolutely suck all the joy out of your life. I remember when I was a 13-year-old boy, most of you have heard my story. I went to work when I was 12 and making the living, paying rent, buying groceries, et cetera. And I was 13 now, and I'd just gotten off of work, and I was to meet with some friends, and we were going to, I forget where we were going to go now, but I was real looking forward to it, and so I ran across the street to the house and was going to get dressed. And my mother said, Daryl, I need what money you've got. And I said, you need all of it? She said, I need all of it. Well, that meant that I've got to go to where the people are waiting for me and tell them at the last minute, I'm not going to be able to go. I'm sorry. And I'm embarrassed to tell them why. I'm embarrassed to tell them that I'm having to give my money to my mama to do whatever. And so I went to where my friends were, and I said to them, look, I'm not going to be able to go. Well, how come? I said, well, I'm not going to be able to go. So I went back to the house, and I remember, and this is the only time I've done this my whole life, I was so disappointed. I was so let down that I laid on the couch and I sobbed. And I sobbed because I felt like life was so unfair. I felt like it was so unfair. I mean, why can't I have just a little bit of money, a little bit of time? Why do I have to fork it over and miss out on meeting with my friends and all? And I don't recall how long that I sobbed. I have no idea. It was that deep. I mean, it just wasn't just tears. It was that deep, gut-wrenching type of disappointment. And after I laid there for a while and sobbed, when I got up, I was hard. I was bitter. And it took me years to get past that bitterness. I mean, years. That one event had sucked out of me any joy, any reason for living. I just thought life is just not fair. And so again, for many years, I could hurt you with my words. I could hurt you with physically and not think twice about it, because I was bitter at life. I was bitter at people. Now, let me go quickly and say this. I don't resent my mother. I think she could have done better. I think she could have made better choices. But I loved her. And when she died, we buried her over here at Camp Memorial. I waited till they lowered her into the ground. I was with her to the last minute. She lived a hard life. I mean, it was a difficult life for her, and I understand that. But as a little boy, now let me quickly say this. I do realize now that God was using that, even though I wasn't a Christian, He was using that to shape and mold me into what He wanted me to become one day. And when I was able to provide for my brothers and my sister, and they grew up and thanked me for it, and of course most of you know this story. My brother Paul, when I turned 50 years of age, we had a big celebration here. I mean, had a big crowd, had people, cousins and aunts and uncles and preachers from all over, and different ones give testimony about what I meant to them and this kind of thing. And my brother Paul, at the last, walked up on the platform and he said, "Hold your hand out." And I did, and he dropped a set of keys in my hand. And I said, "What's that for?" He said, "I want to give it to you." It was a 94 pickup truck with only 10,000 miles on it. He said, "You've done so much for us, and I want to do this for you." And often when we talk, and I call him about once every month, he'll say, "Darrell, thank you so much for stepping into that slot." But what I'm saying is, that moment, I was so disappointed, I was so disillusioned, that it affected me for a good number of years. So here's these disciples who had been planning on this leader doing all these things that he told them that he would do. And now he's dead. And so they're walking along and they're sad. Very, very, very sad. And I see people in our churches that are sad. And you can recognize, I mean, there's certain flags that you can spot in a person who's reached a point where they're disappointed, disillusioned. For instance, going to church is no longer a joy to them. The psalmist said, "I was glad when they said unto me, let's go into the house of God." Well, maybe so when you first got saved. Maybe so for a while. But if you're not careful, you'll drag yourself out of bed. For whatever reason, you've been disillusioned, been disappointed. And you show up, but not necessarily glad. I mean, that's a red flag. When a person has lost the joy, the excitement of getting together with God's people, when you lose that, and it's obvious because many, many times you'll see them, they'll start out on the front pew, and after a while they go to the middle pew, and after a while they end up on the back pew, and you think they don't have much further to go and they'll be out the door. But they've lost the joy, they've lost the excitement, they've lost the thrill of being in the house of God. Or if you watch them sing, the singing is half-hearted. I mean, used to they sang with gusto, but not anymore. And it is just so as a matter of fact, and I've watched this through the years, they get put on the schedule to sing. And they're excited about it. But after a while, they begin to make excuses and try to get out of it. They've lost the excitement, the joy of serving the Lord. Oh my soul! And this has been such a burden to me for these 59 years I've been serving Him. When I was first saved, we had a guy named Galen Boed, and Galen was one of the finest men I've ever met, and he had a stroke. So they fixed a big old chair for him to sit in, and put it over here, and they'd walk him in, help him get in, and sit him in that chair. And it affected his speech, it affected his ability to walk. And I'd come down, I'd shake hands with him, I'd say, "Brother Galen, how you doing?" He said, "Brother Darrell, God's better to me than He is you." I said, "Now, I'm going to have to argue that point with you." He said, "No, I'm just telling you, God." Now here he is with a stroke. Here his speech is affected. Here he is, his ability to walk. And yet he's saying that God is so good to him. I mean, he never lost that joy. And there was a guy that over in Fayetteville, North Carolina, and he loved to sing in the choir, but he had something that happened to him that affected his speech. And so he could only make a little circle with his mouth. He couldn't move his mouth. He just, a little old circle. And he sing like this. But he'd get in that choir, and boy, I'll tell you, he'd rear back and he'd sing. And I loved to watch him because it was coming from here. I mean, it wasn't performance. It wasn't just because he had to. He loved singing for the Lord. And I've had the privilege of being around individuals like that. I tell you, I may have told you this, Open Door Baptist Church here in Sonoa, there's a little lady, she had the palsy, and her little old body would shake real bad. And but she was one of the soloists. And they would help her come to the platform, and somebody would hold the songbook for her, because otherwise she would be like this. And she would stand there, and she would sing from the bottom of her heart. I mean, what a thrill it was to the audience. I mean, her voice wasn't pretty. It wasn't polished, but it was just, she sang from the bottom of her heart. And sad people who've been disillusioned, people who've been disappointed, people who've been let down by, and you can be let down by people. You can be disappointed in others, but if you're not careful to get your joy and your excitement all from the Lord, then it can suck the life out of you. And so I watch them as they no longer enjoy going to church. They no longer enjoy singing for the Lord because they just force themselves to. They've lost the joy of being forgiven. I know I've told you this story before, but my son Todd called me. There was a little lady on his job that he'd been witnessing to. And after a period of time, she came into his office and she said, "Todd, I want you to tell me how to be saved. So Todd took the scriptures and showed her how to be saved. She wept. She squalled. She cried. Because she now had the joy of being forgiven. Do you know what that means? Do you know what that means to have all of your sins washed away? I mean, every one of them, not a one of them remembered against you anymore. What a joy that is. And so she was thrilled at being saved. Well, I think it was the next day or maybe the day after that, he walked by our office and he saw her with her hands over her face and she's squalling. And he walked in and he said, "Honey, are you okay?" And she looked up and with a smile on her face, she said, "I just can't get over the fact that God was willing to save me and forgive me." See, we can't get over that. If you do, you're going to be a sad Christian. So here's these disciples walking along the road, and what they're doing, they're looking at things that as they seem to be, but not focusing on the promises of God. So they're sad. They just and you cannot look at things as they seem to be and stop there. You've got to look at the promises that God made, and if you don't, you're going to have a lot of sadness. I think of Thomas. Bless his heart. Thomas, you know the story, but Thomas was so let down, so disappointed, and so he just got out of church, just got away from the other disciples, and for 8 days he wasn't a part of the fellowship. For 8 days. He kept looking back to that Wednesday. Kept looking back to that Wednesday. Kept looking back to that Wednesday. And he was so let down. 8 days. I'm talking about Thursday and Friday and Saturday. I mean, day after. He is so sad and so disillusioned. And then finally, when they went to him and said, "Thomas, the Lord's alive." And he said, "Well, I'm not going to believe that unless I see the prints in his hands and the hole in his side." So for 8 days, he's been focusing on Wednesday. For 8 days, he's been sad and disillusioned and disappointed and let down for 8 days. And then finally, when he does go, and the Lord says, "Thomas, look. Won't you look?" He fell down and said, "My Lord and my God." And went on to become one of the best disciples ever. When I had the privilege of going overseas, there was a big statue there as we approached the runway. There was a big statue on the left, and they said, "Thomas came to this place and preached the gospel." And they erected a statue to him. But for 8 days. And if you're not careful, you focus on what seems to be rather than on the promises that God has made. For instance, you may say, "Well, I'm going to tell you something. It just looks like my labor is in vain. It looks like I work and I work and I try and nothing seems to change, and so you focus on that, and if you do, you're going to be disappointed." But the promise is that your labor is not in vain, that you shall reap if you faint not. Now that's his promise. But you can focus on the fact that you're trying and trying and trying and trying, and nothing is changing, and nobody's doing any better, and you can become so disillusioned, so disappointed, because that's what your focus is, instead of the promise that God has made, that your labor is not in vain, But you shall reap if you faint not.
Amen.
And so you can shrug your shoulders and say, well, I don't understand, but I know what God said. And that's what these disciples should have done. They should have said, well, I know what it looks like. It looks like it's over, but I know what he said, that in 3 days he'd rise again. Or you can say, I'm going to tell you something. I don't understand. I've prayed and I've prayed and I've prayed, and it looks like my prayers are not getting answered, and you can become so disillusioned. I've had dozens through the years to say to me, preacher, there's no reason to pray. I've prayed and my children are the same. I've prayed and my husband isn't any different. I've prayed and my health is still in turmoil, and well, that's focusing on what seems to be. But the promise is, if you ask, if you seek, if you knock, it shall be given to you. Now that's his promise. Now you may pray for years. I think it was 11 years I prayed for my little mother. I mean, you've heard my story, but for those who haven't, I had witnessed to Mom. I had wept over her. I had witnessed to her, and she never would. She was proud that I got saved, but she never would give her heart to Christ. And I was concerned about that, because I had heard mothers say from the time I was a little boy, I wish I could just start walking and disappear. Wish I could just lay down and go to sleep and never wake up. And so when I would come home from school, if I'd tried to get in the house and the door was locked, first thought in my mind was, Mother's in there dead. Lived with that for years. So now I'm a Christian, and not only am I thinking she may be dead, but she'll be in hell. And so that bothered me, and it bothered me. And so I tried to witness to her and tried to win her to Christ. And finally, I just couldn't, and you, again, most of you heard my story, but I couldn't live with that. I couldn't live with the thought of my little mother being in hell. So I told my wife, I said, I'm going to the church. And if I can find a way in, I'm going to get in and I'm going to go to the altar, and I'm going to stay there until God assures me that he's going to save my mother. I said, I may be back later today, maybe tomorrow, maybe next week, I'm not sure, but I'm not leaving until I get assurance that my mother's going to get saved. So I found a window that wasn't locked. I climbed in and went down to the altar, and about 6 o'clock that evening, and I knelt there at the altar and I said, now Lord, I'm here. And I'm here for my mom. And I can't stand the thought that she may go to hell. So I need you to assure me that you're going to save her. I don't know when, I don't know how, but I'm going to ask you to give me assurance, because I need that assurance. Well, 6 became 7, 7 became 8, 8 became 10, 10 became 1, 1 became 3. Finally, about 6 or 7 o'clock in the morning, it's like the Lord just flooded my soul with assurance that he's going to save my mother. So from that point on, when people would say, well, preacher, is your mama saved? I said, well, not yet, but she's going to be. I just knew in my heart, because God, I knew that was his will, and I knew that he said, if you ask, then you can receive. And again, most of you have heard this story. I tell it for those who haven't, but I finally got her to come to church one night. She'd never come to church. She finally came one night, sit back there at the back. I gave the altar call. She never responded. And finally, I had to let the people go, and so I let them go. My daughter, Kim, who was 7 at the time, went back and grabbed her by the skirt and tugged on it and said, Grandmother, why don't you get saved? Tore her up. She went to the bathroom, squalled, came back out. She's in there about 15 minutes when she came back out. Kim was still standing there, but Michelle, my niece, had joined her. And Kim said, "Grandmother, why don't you get saved tonight?" And she said, "Well, girls, y'all just pray for me." Well, those two little old girls, 7 and 6 years old, just fell to their knees. And that was it. I watched her walk that aisle. I met her about midway, slipped my arm around her, came over to this part of the altar, and I heard her as she lifted both hands toward heaven. Said, "Lord, I'm a sinner. I want you to save me." You could look at things as they seem, or you can look at the promise of God. And if you look at things as they are, you're going to get disappointed, disillusioned. But if you look at the promise of God, I mean, you see, you say, "Well, I tell you what, I can't take any more. I cannot bear any more. This load is too heavy. I cannot bear any more." Well, that seems to be the case. But the truth of it is, before that load came your way, God weighed it. God put it on His scales to make sure the load was not more than you could handle. And He said, "I'll not put on you any more than you can bear." That's the promise. So you can look at things as they are, or you can look at the promise of God and say, "Well, I'm just going to believe the promise of God." And had these disciples, instead of focusing on Wednesday, had they focused on the promise that Jesus had made, 3 days and I'll be up, I'll be out, I'll be live again, they wouldn't have gone through that sad part. They wouldn't. Listen, I'm going to tell you something. There is no reason for me to doubt, because I live on this side of Sunday. I live on this side. I can look back and say He made a lot of claims, and every one of them, He kept. I do not want to be a sad Christian. I do not want to be one that goes around with the mully grubs. There's a little lady in a restaurant that I go to, and she's a sweet little lady. She's had some big problems in her life. I remember one time I came into town and I went by there and I said, "Friend," I said, "you doing okay?" She said, "Well, no, not really." And I said, "Well, if I don't see you again till after Christmas, I hope you have a nice Christmas." She said, "I'm not celebrating Christmas this year." And I said, "Oh, how come?" She said, "You haven't heard?" I said, "No, I'm just getting into town." And she said, "It was in the newspaper." She said, "My granddaughter killed her 2-year-old child and is in jail right now." And she said, "I am so sad, so disillusioned." And I said, "Friend, I am so sorry. I did not know that." But she has let that dominate her life. And I'm sure that's a horrible thing. But it's dominated her life to where when I was in there the day before yesterday, I hadn't seen her in some time, and I said, "Friend, are you doing okay?" And she said, "No, not really." And she went on to tell me her woes and her sad tale, and I thought, that is not the will of God. God doesn't want us to keep looking at Sunday and what happened from 9 o'clock to 3 o'clock. He wants us to look at, or I said Sunday, I mean Wednesday. He wants us to look at Sunday when He walked out of that grave. So I don't want to be a sad, and I'm sure you don't either. I don't want to be a sad Christian. Do you? I tell you, that's too contagious. This is too heavy. I don't know that I can handle it. Well, He says, all things work together for good to them that love God. Can you say amen to that? Amen. Thank you.